Oh, you missed the first 30 seconds. This is a list of the Takunda interventions. Again, not going through all of them, but just leaving them on for a second. So highlighting a few important ones: supplementary feeding, care groups, it's cash facets, village and savings groups, it's farmer field schools, wash interventions, life skill trainings for youth, the TVET training program, and then a number of other activities. So it's a multifaceted program. And then we sort of in the beginning, there was a collaborative process with CARE and with BHA to design an impact evaluation to target the learning questions, the questions that the implementer have, that BHA has. And so this is the following is the basic RCT of the overall impact. So the research question is, what's the impact on consumption, child nutrition, and other outcomes of interest of the overall program? And so what it looks like is we start with the RIFSA target area, which is those 4 districts across those 2 provinces we talked about, includes 92 wards and 564 village clusters. From those, we randomly sampled 161 to be the study area. That's on the left here. You see the mouse? I think so, right? The study area. And those so evenly spread by districts and ward to get a good coverage of the project area. And then we've got these non-study village clusters, which you can see it's much larger than the study area where the project is implemented, but we're not conducting the study. And so then within the study area, those 161 village clusters were randomly assigned to either treatment and control, and treatment in this case meant RIFSAs taking place, so it's targeted by the Takunda RIFSA, and in the control group, no RIFSA is supposed to take place. And then the idea is that we do household surveys that compare households in the treatment villages with households in the control villages for a number of outcomes of interest at different points in time. And then we compare at the same point in time 4 different outcomes. What's the difference, let's say, in average outcomes? That's going to be the basis for any estimates of treatment effects that of the overall impact of the program that we present. So it's household surveys, we did a baseline. There were 3,000 households. A midline is planned starting later this year, and then an end line in the following year. Any questions about the RCT in general that we can get out of the way? If there are slides, I'm not seeing them. Is anybody else seeing the slides? Everybody else, yeah.
We see slides clearly, Lasse. No questions yet. Thank you.
Okay, because someone's saying they're not seeing the slides. Okay, then, so this is the RCT of the overall program. And what we have in addition is to hone in on one particular intervention of interest that kind of lends itself to a more focused piece of research that was of interest to BHA, to CARE, and deemed sort of feasible to study in this context, and you know, interesting for the larger learning for the literature. And that's a formal TVET program that was part of Takunda. And so here the research questions: what's the impact on participants of this TVET intervention on employment, income, and other outcomes of interest, and starts with an assessment of 3,060 youth that across the implementation areas that Takunda conducted. Out of those 1,200 eligibles were identified, and then those we randomly assigned individually either to offer participation in the TVET program or not. And so then the baseline survey is rolled out in 2 cohorts, and then there'll be a follow-up survey next year. So just highlighting these 2, this is the basis. Mainly we're going to be referring to the RCT of the overall impact, but just also highlighting we've got this, what we sometimes call micro experiment in this context, also separately to the overall RCT. And then now for the process evaluation methodology, first the objectives. Right? The idea is to complement the impact evaluation and support the result interpretation. We generate qualitative evidence about key interventions and beneficiary experiences. I'll get to what key interventions are in a second. And the first step is to understand the program, which interventions ended up being carried out, with whom and how. So we're facing a large program with many components, potentially across many areas. And in the end, we'll have surveyed people in treatment areas and control areas, and we'll get, for each outcome, we'll get sort of one number. This is the treatment effect. In order to interpret what this means, we first need to know what the thing was that we're evaluating, and that's a big part of this process evaluation procedure. Also helps us to identify bottlenecks and areas for improvement that we can pass on to the implementer and to BHA along the way. Now, putting up the list of interventions again, just to see, and then I'm going to put up a second slide that has some details here on those interventions. So first, I'm going to cross out the last three. They're not part of the process evaluation because we have limited resources and need to focus our attention. So those are low intensity and less widely spread, at the very least at the time the process evaluation was happening. Then the starred ones are, we did a desk review only, no primary data collection. Again, with the idea that those are less amenable and less areas of focus. And so these other ones that are not starred or crossed out, we did primary data collection for and the desk review. And then finally, the bolded ones are the ones that are identified as key interventions from the perspective of the RCT in terms of expected impact, expected importance for the outcomes of interest. So that's supplementary feeding, that with the substantial resource transfers, the expanded care groups that go along with those with the feeding, and then the TVET training specifically because it's a separate experiment. But then I think it's left out of the presentation today because of this slightly different focus relative to the overall impact. See
Awesome.
Tom, you have a hand up?
Yeah, a very quick question here. Sorry to interrupt, but it's a good one from Carl Wall, and he was wondering how clustered are the VCs. He was wondering whether the RIFSA VCs were near to the no RIFSA VCs. Were they contiguous?
Yeah, and so in general, they could be. We should make a map. In practice, since we stratified them here, they'll be somewhat spread out. And so these 161 are stratified by districts and wards, and that so they'll be somewhat spread out. And then, but so in principle, they can be next to each other. In practice, they won't always be. But I don't have the specific numbers or a map to show today. But it's something we should produce. It's a good idea. Okay, let me go to the data sources here. So a big part of the process evaluation from our perspective is a desk review and basic fact finding. So we review the program documentation, manuals, SOPs, and other documents that describe the program, which evolve as the program goes on and as the program starts up. So it's not always clear what the details are of the intervention at the beginning of the design of the evaluation. Then we review monitoring data that we receive from the implementing partner to get a sense of where activity is happening and how much. And then we have regular meetings with IP to clarify what's going on and just to have kind of this regular interaction that allows us to also be made aware of changes in the program, for example, that are important for the RCT. And then we have this primary data collection, and we'll describe some of which we'll describe in detail. Just listing here, it consists of participant interviews, the a number of interviews are on the in parentheses across the different program components. We have some Takunda staff interviews, then some meeting spot checks, and some site visits. And then again, the decision which to go after here is sort of a combination of us suggesting a set, then getting feedback from BHA and CARE, and then coming to some agreement which types of visits and interviews should be done. And this is what ended up happening in practice. So geographic coverage here is across all 4 districts of the that were targeted by the RIFSA, happened earlier this year. Just to get a sense of where things are taking place. And then some of the topics covered, or a high level description of the topics covered by this field work were enrollment and the selection process and targeting, barriers to participation, participant experiences, participant feedback, some looking into participant dropout, and then details regarding training sessions attended. And again, we don't have everything on everything, and we're also not every question on every intervention we looked at, and we're also not going to be talking about all of it here, but there's a lengthier report that goes along with this presentation, but we're just going to be highlighting a few things that come up and try to give a summary at the end. In particular, insofar as it relates to the RCT and the role of the process evaluation to complement the RCT. On the first step in terms of results here, looking at the monitoring data we received from the implementer to give us a sense of just at a high level what was being done according to the records of the implementer. And I'm just going to go through this table here, not in every detail, but just to give a sense of what this looks like. And I'm going to summarize it in the next slide. So for each of the interventions, we can look at the share of the village clusters in the treatment areas that were covered by the project, the share of villages, the number of households in thousands of each, number of individuals, and then also the average number of households in those villages where the intervention's happening, to get a sense of the intensity at the village level. So then first for any intervention, in this case, happened in 100% of village clusters, 100% of villages with 14,000 households, and an average of 33 households per village. Then we can break that down for each intervention. We'll see that kind of the supplementary feeding program was universally implemented essentially, with an average of 16 households per village. 7,000 households again in the treatment areas. And then we can look at the same numbers for the other interventions, and then we can quickly pick out a few. We see that VSLAs are also nearly universally implemented. So this is 95% of the villages. But then the other interventions are not universally implemented, and for some of them, the coverage rates are much lower. So farmer field schools are in 60% of the villages of the treatment areas, and then care groups take place in less than half, and then the numbers go down for some of the other interventions, noting that some of the interventions were not supposed to take place in all villages. They're more targeted, for example, TVET, or even I think life skills. But the point is less to discuss, what is the actual, at least for now, what is the actual, was this according to target or not? Is that the point here is that the comparisons we're making between treatment and control will be driven by whatever programming was going on in treatment areas and was not going on in control areas. to me just, oh, I wanted to have this go point by point, but let's go point by point. So the first conclusion is the key requirements for a successful RCT in this case are met. We have implementation in all assigned areas, which is great. At least, some implementation. So it's sort of the minimum requirement. And implementation actually looks very similar to implementation in the broader project in the non-study areas, which then gives us some confidence that what we're finding should be broadly applicable to the larger RIFSA. And then the control areas were almost entirely excluded from implementation. So I'm not showing the table here. It's relatively straightforward, except for very few instances. There was no implementation control areas. So this is what we'd ideally like to see: implementation and treatment, no implementation control, and then that's going to give us the maximum precision for estimation and the highest of chance to document effects from the program. And now the interpretation of the RCT results, again, remembering we're comparing, let's say, the typical household in the treatment area with a typical household in the control area, is going to be driven by the coverage and the coverage of the specific interventions that were done. So implementation of individual interventions was higher, very high for two interventions in particular, the SFP and the VSLAs, and then less so for other interventions, including for those for which high coverage would have been expected at the start of the design stage of the evaluation. And then we also have limited participation or intensity of interventions for some of the interventions, which will imply a lower importance for the result interpretation, even when the village coverage is high. So what does this mean in practice? If we go back here, we can see the VSLAs, for example, are implemented almost everywhere, but then only with 9 households in a village, due to the self-selection, and also looking at the fact that VSLA is in quotation marks, just people coming together and helping each other save and raise capital, as opposed to high intensity interventions such as food transfers, will limit the importance for any differences in outcomes we find between treatment and control. Okay, I see Tom's hands is up.
Yeah, and it's no new questions as of yet, Lasse, only a time check. I know that the design of this impact evaluation is quite involved and all of this is relevant. We just want to save time for the findings because we're sure there'll be questions about them. So thanks.
Yeah. So this is just to be clear, so this is a finding from my perspective, like a key part of the process evaluation. The whole larger process, process evaluation is not just the primary data collection, the field work, but also this larger understanding of what's going on with the RIFSA, the coverage, what interventions were actually carried out. And so thanks for the time check, concluding here essentially, but I just wanted to highlight this. So this is a result of the process evaluation, the work that goes into getting this data, understanding this data, iterating with the IP on this data, and then analyzing it. With that, nice transition prodded by Tom. I'm handing over to Stephanie. I was going to go through some highlights from the field work that was done. I think I need to stop sharing and then someone else will, if I'm mistaken. But Stephanie, you let me know.
Hi, Lasse. I think you can continue. Thank you.
Okay. So I should. Okay.
All right. Thank you. Hello, everyone. So just continuing from where Lasse left off. So for the field activities, we are presenting highlights for some of the activities. So the first activity we want to present on has to do with the supplementary feeding program. This was a program where food rations made of corn soya blends were given to pregnant women, lactating women, and children who are under 3, as well as fortified vitamin A oil. For this activity, we did 41 participant interviews, and then we also spoke with three commodity distributors within the various wards. We did the interviews. It's worth noting that we had one person who was coordinating both Buhera and Mutari, and that's why we did only 3 distributor interviews. Yeah. So based on some of the findings we found, one of the important things we saw is that all the respondents indicated that the eligibility criteria was communicated to them clearly. However, not all of them could recall the criteria. And most of the participants could recall that being pregnant was one of the criteria. And then quite a number also could recall that lactating women and children under 2 years were also met the criteria. Yeah. Can we? And then in trying to understand how much rations people were getting, we wanted to confirm with people when they got their last distribution. At the time we were doing the process evaluation, we realized there was a cycle of distribution going on. So there were respondents who might have received their last ration in November, and there were some who had received in that January-February period. And most of them told us that they received 1.8 liters of fortified vegetable oil at a distribution cycle, at their last distribution, and 7 kilograms of the Koya soy blend. And this was in line with the SOPs that, or with the manual that CARE had in place for the distributions. This meant that at each cycle, they received 2 rations. Because every ration was supposed to be about 0.9 liters and then 3.5 kilograms. And then from discussions with CARE, rations were distributed every other month. So they gave 2 rations at a time, and that's exactly what we found. We also realized that most people had received at least 9.5 rations on average since they started joining the program until the time we were doing the distribution. We have a breakdown by the categories here. Yeah, that's it. Can we move on? Okay, and to receive these rations, most of the participants informed us that they usually spent about less than an hour to walk to the distribution sites, which they felt was okay, and then they had to wait for 54 minutes. Within this 54 minutes, a lot of things happened, verifications, and then also getting the rations distributed between them. Although they felt that this was acceptable, they made some recommendations in the next slide that we wanted to talk about. In terms of the distribution points, let me start from the distribution angle. They felt that there's a need to, in as much as they felt the travel time and the wait time was acceptable, they felt that it could still be reduced more drastically to make the process more cleaner, more time efficient, and then also not to have to use all their productive hours. So they felt that if the number of distribution points could be expanded subsequently, and then at those expanded points, that agents could be increased so that the distribution will go faster. And then also to ensure that the sanitary nature of the food being given, to ensure that it's the right quantity and there are no fluctuations due to wastages, and also it's being handled safely. They also recommended that the rations should be pre-packed instead of them having to come through with containers and bowl, and then they are put in groups and then they measure. Additionally, they also felt that to help improve transparency in enrollment of people, it will be important to have community members, especially village heads and workers and people who are familiar as part of the process, to ensure that it's the right people and people who maybe are within the communities who are being put on the program. And then they also were requesting for the extension in the registration period. I think one of the things why this was coming on from CARE, we heard that enrollment had finished in September, and that is why, one of the reasons why they were requesting for this. And then we tried to look at the relationship between this supplementary feeding program with expanded care groups, because one of CARE's aim was to encourage those who benefited from the supplementary feeding program to participate in the care groups to ensure that there's enhancement of the benefits. As they are getting the nutrition food packages, they are learning more about behavior change and then how to use these nutritions to ensure that the outcomes around nutrition and health that wanted to be addressed could be done. Looking at the coverage data, one of the things we noticed was that we had about just 38% of the participants who were engaged in ECG, that is expanded care groups, which was quite low. Potential explanations for this participation were likely in some areas, since lead mothers were more of volunteers who gave their time. So in some areas, there was a lack of volunteers to serve as lead mothers. In some areas too, there was insufficient number of women to form a group. And when there was an insufficient number and people had to go for a longer distance, most people were not willing to travel that long distance. And that is some of the factors that were affecting that. And I think for the one around lead mothers, one of the recommendations was that if there could be a way of incentivizing people so that we can have more people commit, and then that could help reduce that. That is one area for exploration. Thank you. The next intervention we looked at had to do with the expanded care groups. So the care group model basically looked at bringing people in the community together to talk about things to help improve health outcomes and also behavior change. The care expanded group model had going beyond mothers with pregnant women, lactating mothers, and then mothers with children under 2 to also identify influential people who could drive change. So they had the neighbor women for the women who met the criteria I previously mentioned. And then there was a group called the elderly women. Hi, Tom.
Hi, Stephanie. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Just a quick question posed by Judy Kanawati. Going back just a little bit to your explanation, you indicated that pregnant women had an average of 9 rations. Can you share how often the rations were distributed? What the frequency was of that?
So rations were distributed every 2 months, but then at every distribution cycle, you got 2 rations to last you 2 months.
Great, thank you very much. If
You're
others
welcome.
have questions, please do post them in the chat. Back to you, Stephanie. Or I'm sorry, put them in the Q&A. Back to you, Stephanie.
Thank you. So for the expanded care groups, we focused mainly on the neighbor women, and then we interviewed 36 women across in
Stephanie, you're breaking up
some
just a
spot
bit.
checks of some lead mother trainings. Some neighbor women pods will be focused around the lead mother. Sorry, the neighbor lead mother.
You maybe turn off the video
All right.
for the safe bandwidth.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So for the expanded care groups, one thing we realized about the groups was that the average size per group, the respondents reported an average of 10 members in their groups. While from the spot checks, we observed 7 members. These numbers were within the number or the size that CARE had indicated in the manual or the SOP for the number of people to be in a group. So that was okay. And then we realized that usually meetings lasted between 34 minutes from the observed sessions and also 50 minutes from the reported sessions. And this was still in line with the SOP that allows them to go about an hour. So that was good. And then we realized that all the women interviewed met at least once a month. Some reported meeting more than once, which was all in line with the manual there. I think definitely the frequency with which they met was determined by how often they needed to discuss maybe particular topics or the demand from participants. Yeah, but they were all within the recommended period. One good thing was that most of the respondents received reminders from their lead manders ahead of the training, so that made them able to honor the invitations for the trainings, and this was in line with this SOP too. And most of the respondents walked an average of 17 minutes from their home to the meeting location, which I think from when you look at the SOP from the clustering and how the groups were formed, it was within an acceptable duration. And then the meetings were mainly held with simple language that everybody could understand, and the terms were broken down slowly for them. And then most of the trainings were held in the local language, which was Shona. In a few instances, there was a mix of Shona and English, but this was understood by the participants. Sorry. Next slide. And the good thing we noticed was that, and which was also reported by the respondents, was that usually they had materials used to facilitate the trainings. So usually there were materials of the topics, and this came in quite handy, especially in some teams where you would find out that maybe there were people who could not talk, but at least they could have the material and follow as discussions went on. They used some flip charts, and then there were sometimes some post-its and other materials that were used. Yeah. Hi, Tom.
Yeah, quick question, I think posed from Taka. And he's wondering how many sessions are they supposed to have had, or is this open-ended?
I think we didn't have a fixed number of sessions. Care could help, but what we understood was that depending on the demands from the particular group and on particular topics, that would help determine how many sessions they had.
Okay. And while we're on this topic, Stephanie, there's another question. Were participants provided with any literature in these care groups?
So at the training point, from the observation, they talked about materials coming in to be used. We didn't ask a specific question about if they were given any literature, but then as you see in the recommendation they made, one of the things they asked was they should be given literature that they could take home so that they could use for revisions and also to go through themselves on their own. So based on that feedback, it's likely maybe it is not being provided, what is provided is not adequate and they wanted more, but we didn't specifically ask that question.
Okay, thank you very much for that response.
You're welcome. Some of the topics, most of them had received lessons around WASH and breastfeeding, as well as complementary feeding and maternal health. Most of them was WASH and breastfeeding, and this is expected because in a number of reasons. One of the things is that the topics covered in various trainings were participant driven. So places where they may have more questions to ask, places where they wanted to learn more is where they are likely to get more questions. And also because of the group of people, the bandwidth, this is expected. And then for the other ones, it's likely other discussions might have taken place, but maybe recall was low, or they were yet to do these particular topics. Yeah. Thank you. Next slide. So in asking participants if they knew of other people who used to be in their groups that had dropped off, 28% of them had indicated that they knew people who dropped off, and most of the dropping off was either driven by moving to a new area or being busy with farm activities. And if there were some too who didn't have interest in the program, so those were the main reasons. There are other reasons which were more minor. Yeah. And then in asking about how satisfied they were with the program, all participants, with the exception of one, were very satisfied. They were satisfied because of the lessons they received and how it helps in changes. They were satisfied with the home visits. I think the one person who expects a bit of dissatisfaction felt that there could have been a need to break down the sessions further than they were, but generally that was the only reason the person gave. Some recommendations were that there's a real look of meeting venues. Most of them met under shades or in the open, and they were at the mercy of the elements of weather. So they felt that if they could have enclosed spaces where they are more protected, that would be helpful. Additionally, if they were
Stephanie, it seems we've lost you. If you're still speaking, Lhasa, can you hear?
I think we've lost her. So she can come back. One thing I could do, since we're at the time that was supposed to allot for a Q&A, I could go to the conclusion, since we've covered the first two of, I think, 4 we had prepared. We probably won't get to all of them anyway.
That's fine. You can adjust as needed. You had mentioned some interesting findings in VSLA. We probably have a few short minutes for that if you want to touch on that before concluding and wrapping up for Q&A.
Yeah, so I think I could just jump to the conclusion, and then we can come back to those details if Stephanie's is back. Can you hear us now, Stephanie?
Yes, I can.
Okay, if you want to jump back in here, finishing with participant feedback, and then if we have time, if you could go through the VSLAs too, and then we'll skip to the conclusion.
Right. Okay. I think we are done with the feedback, so we can move to the VSLA, and then we can skip. Okay. So the village savings and loans, we did interviews with 12 members and 4 spot checks across the wards. Some of the key findings we saw were, the average reported group size was 15 members, and this was in line with the SOP, which recommends 15 to 25 members. In the observed sessions too, the average was about 28. It was slightly larger, but then it was still within bandwidth. Most of the respondents reported having someone who dropped out of their groups, and the average of that was 2. The main reason was people lacking funds to commit, as the fees they pay in the VSLAs, they contribute towards the activities, and then also relocations. Yeah. All right. And in terms, the other thing we found out is that most of all the participants we interviewed had been saving with their VSLAs, and then 10 out of 12 had reported that they had borrowed from their VSLAs in the past 3 months, and most of them are taking an average of 2 loans, and the average amount they had borrowed was $50. The loans were usually for investment into their business and agricultural ventures, to provide food for their homes and to pay for their fees or give to lines. And this, I think, is still about empowerment for businesses and also for family and all of that. So it's in line with the VSLA strategy and what it seeks to achieve. One of the respondents' feedback they had was that they would love to have expanded and supported links and access to banks so they could obtain larger loans to help them expand their businesses as they grow, and then also have links and access to markets to enable them to sell their goods and their services. Next slide, please. With the spot checks we observed, they were well organized. The facilitators came in punctually. They carried all the requirements that they needed, and then they adhered to the guidelines for organizing the meetings. Most of the sessions had a recap of the previous session, and then discussions, and then there was a strong understanding of the topics. And then the presentations were more of interactive, where participants were asking questions, they were kept engaged, there were demonstrations, there were stories, and all of that. And then the sessions were usually about 104 meetings and conducted in Shona, and I think this was within the meeting time, which was also good. Yeah, next. Yeah. Hi.
Okay, I think in the interest of time, perhaps we should jump to the conclusion slide, and we can revert back to the Farmer Field School and life skills slides if we have time. That's okay.
All right. Okay. Thank you.
Okay,
Let's
sounds
back
good.
to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much. I mean, we did take a few questions along the way, so we've covered some of the Q&A, but let me just flip forward here. So what we had for today is still available. It was talking about the SLAs and the life skill program. But let me conclude first with some highlights, and maybe we can dive back into some of the specifics or even cover those topics if there's time. So overall, what were the process variations finding that the core interventions were mostly well implemented and in line with SOPs. So say mostly well implemented, because from what we saw, there were a few things that were highlighted in this presentation and in the report that are noteworthy, but in general, things were in line with the targets, in line with how they're supposed to be carried out, and to the extent that we covered and spot checked, were well implemented. Found that facilitators were generally well prepared, and also that participants were satisfied with interventions. We covered in the beginning of the presentation that the implementations generally adhere to the RCT design and can therefore, in principle, support a successful impact evaluation. So we're not in a state of the world where, for example, the control group was treated, or such a small part of the treatment areas was actually covered that it wouldn't be worthwhile to conduct an impact evaluation. And at the same time, the implementation coverage rates and the intensities I discussed when talking about the coverage of the different interventions means that the impacts we estimate in the RCT will be driven just sort of based on theory, not based on empirics, but just based on knowing what goes into the treatment here on average, will be driven by the SFP, the food transfers. I don't know, then we have a few discussion points. And then we can also go back to the other parts that we skipped if there's time. And I'm seeing Arif has a question. Maybe I can just jump into that. Did you check the knowledge of participants of the care group? What did they learn in the past sessions? Maybe Stephanie can take that, and just then noting that the nature of this qualitative small scale nature of these visits isn't necessarily going to give us answers like at kind of with high precision about these types of intermediate outcomes. Those would be good questions to add if we have them in a quantitative survey in the midline that's coming up. But Stephanie, maybe you can jump in with what we learned during the process evaluation fieldwork.
Yeah, thank you. I think as we had said, most of the knowledge they shared was around child health and feeding, breastfeeding practices. So and wash. So you can tell that, you can hear them telling you that things around they learned that before they feed their children, they needed to clean their hands and clean the breast and give the children food as often as it was needed. You have them talking about things around hygiene practices for themselves and also for their homes. You have them talking about the need for having washstands in the house. There were things around eating nutritious meal for themselves when they are pregnant and going for antenatal care, as well as taking their children for under 5 practices and all of that. So those were the main things that stood out. And then they also spoke about transitioning from exclusive breastfeeding to complementary feeding, so and weaning. Yeah, so those were some of the things that came up.
Yeah. So then just to summarize, so what we showed here were the lessons received, right? And then Arif is asking about the actual knowledge, and then you gave some example of some of the stuff that, some of the evidence of learning that came up in the field work.
Yes.
Thank
yes.
you. And I think then you can just, maybe I can just read the questions and then hand over to you. Do you have the performance of the savings for assets groups? Maybe this is from Taka. Maybe you can add more detail to the question, or maybe come live to explain a bit further. I wouldn't know how to. Oh, cash for assets, I see. Do we have the performance maybe you can come live and ask the question, like elaborate a little bit what you're looking for. I suspect the answer is no, but maybe you can just tell us what you mean by performance.
Like, do you have any results from the cash for assets groups? You have presented results for the VSLAs.
Yeah, so I think so. Stephanie, I'm just going to call on Stephanie. I think the cash for assets were covered by the primary data collection, but then so Stephanie can speak to that. We don't have slides in this presentation today, but then just also to highlight here the importance of cash for assets overall for the program is relatively minimal. So in this coverage here, treatment area, you see cash for assets at the bottom, only taking place in less than a third of the villages with an average of 9 people where it is happening. So 1,000 people in total. So if you divide the 9 by the 3, then for the unconditional average village, we would only have 3 people participating. So would be measuring an average outcome in the treatment group where 3 people in treatment villages where 3 people participated in cash for assets. And so yeah, Stephanie can come in on whatever we saw, but just highlighting that it's not relevant for the RCT essentially.
Yeah, we did collect results about cash for assets, which is in the results. Basically, for the participants we interviewed who are taking part in cash for assets, most of them had received at least one payment, and then they had received the expected amount for the payments for which was 48 USD. Yeah. So that is what that is like the summary I can give. If there's any specific question to attend to, I can attend to that.
Okay, great. Thanks, Stephanie. Yeah, and so if there's follow-up questions, please do ask them. We may not, but we may have answers to the specific questions on the performance. And it's Stephanie, that would be in the report too, right? Those results.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it's in the report. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Did you collect any data related to Takunda's resilient design interventions? If so, what were the results? Over to you, Stephanie.
So for the
me personally, I'm not 100% sure what this refers to.
maybe it would be helpful to get some further explanation of, and then we can respond.
Mm-hmm. So this question is from
Gwen-Ellen, feel free to come off mute and clarify the question or what you'd like to hear from IPA if you're able.
Yeah, I'm curious. So resilient design, they were basically interventions around climate resistant agriculture. So helping farmers to produce, to improve the quantity and quality of what they produced in the face of climate change, climatic shocks and whatnot. So I'm just curious if there was any data collected with that about that. It probably would have been in your assessment of the FFBS groups. So just wondering if you have any data on that and what the results were. I hope that's helpful.
Clear. Yeah, that's clear. Thank you. Let me just go here real quick. We didn't talk about that. Maybe you can just take 2 minutes to walk us through that, Stephanie, if you want.
All right, thank you. I can walk through this and then. So basically, the Farmer Field Business School, the curriculum involved them talking about topics that would help to improve agricultural practices, both for livestock and for plants, and then also community well-being and financial literacy. And then there were things around health and gender issues, and also community, living in peace in the community, which was with the curriculum. Most of the teams we met to were satisfied with the training, but then one concern they had is that they felt that the training group size was larger, so they would have preferred smaller training groups where there could be more contact time and they could learn more. Most of the sessions lasted for not more than 2 hours. most of the sessions lasted between 1 hour and 3 hours as reported, and the one we observed was 1 hour 28 minutes, which was somewhere within what the SOP had recommended. And most of the groups met twice or more each month. I think it depended on how the season and the timing, so that affected their flexibility. And also, since the program adapted to what their needs were, groups that had more needs met more frequently than those who felt they already knew some of these adaptable changes. And then these were usually done using the Shona language and simple ways. The interventions were well explained. One of the things we realized was that, next slide. In the observation, while the facilitators were demonstrated a technical understanding, most of them came in without all the necessary materials, and then sometimes they might have had a topic for the day, but then they kept on jumping from one place to the other haphazardly, or so that is an area for improvement. And then sometimes they may not have broken down the topic clearly for the participants. So you may have participants following up, asking several questions. Sometimes maybe what is like specific based questions. We also, though it is not presented here, we had also asked questions to the participants about whether they had gotten training in some of the, but it's in the report, they've gotten training in some of the climate friendly or like this new conservation methods. And then we have some participants responding yes or no. Some were struggling to recall some of those trainings, but yes, we do have a bit of information on that based on feedback they gave us.
Which would be in the report, right? That's
yes,
correct?
yes, it's in the report. Thank you.
And
yes,
then
please.
also, I should say, so those are good questions that we can follow up with in the quantitative survey of the midline. So if there are specific questions, so we have already worked on the instrument, and we have that more or less ready. And it does cover this knowledge of and application of improved practices. And so that would be a good opportunity to collect this information, because we'll be going to a large, over 3,000 people random sample of participants, of households in the treatment areas. And so would be great to get input, whether those questions that you might have are covered by the questions that we have in there, so we can answer that question fully when we have completed the midline later this year. Okay, we're coming up on time. Let me just quickly see. So when will the report be ready? I think someone can type the answer from our team. And then
yeah, I can just state that really quickly. BHA has reviewed and approved the final version of the report, so it's in SAVE's hands now. We're finalizing it. We should have it posted and publicly available within the next couple of weeks.
Okay, great. But then again, just plugging that now is the great time for giving us, making sure we have the questions in our surveys that you want answered. Since we're, and the nature of the process evaluation primary data collection is qualitative and very limited, and so the much more robust findings would come up from a quantitative survey that we're going to roll out soon. So any input be appreciated.
Thank you.
There's
So maybe we have
one more
time for
question
just this
from
one
Carl.
last question before closing. Sorry to interrupt. It's from Carl. He's asking, were participation criteria only presented at the beginning of the program? I think eligibility criteria probably.
So from my understanding, yes, at the beginning in the engagements it was presented, but then for different activities as enrollment went on, they still spoke about it. For example, with SFP, because it was an ongoing enrollment, and then there was also the graduation module, there was continuous engagement in helping people to know what the criteria was, and to also to enroll them on them. Yeah, I think CARE can also weigh in to support on this. Thank you.
Yes, and I see Walter has a question, so let's try to squeeze that one in. Walter, please come off mute and feel free to ask.
Hi, thanks a lot to IPA for the presentation. So just confirming, as we think about the numbers, what when you say 67% coverage care groups, just the month that you used our data to get that. Thank you.
Thanks over to Stephanie or Montserrat who's been putting
Yeah.
together this
So-
this data.
Okay. All right, Walter. So with the last data set you shared with us in January 2024, from I think when you started to January 2024, that was the data that was used to generate these coverage numbers.
All right, thank you.
Yes, great. Thank you for the excellent questions. Thanks for the very useful responses to the IPA team. As they've all mentioned, there are more detailed responses to each of these questions that you'll see in the final report, which will be available here very shortly. We appreciate everyone's participation today. Again, building on this process evaluation, IPA will next be collecting data for the midline evaluation of the Takunda program. We want to thank them for all of their research, for your participation today. If there are any questions, burning questions that we haven't had time to address today, please share those questions with us and we'll get you a response as soon as possible. In the meantime, thank you all. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, May.
Thank you.
Thank you, bye.
Week off. Okay, I didn't.